Good afternoon. On today's Full Scottish, it's Sunday the 23rd of June, and my name is Brian Liddy. I'm joined today by two guests. We've got Paul McLennan, SNP MSP for East Lothian since 2021 and Minister for Housing. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us, Paul.
Good to see you.
And we're also joined today by Anthony Salamone. Anthony's a leading Scottish political scientist, analyst, and thinker, and he's managing director of European Merchants, the political analysis firm. Again, thank you, Anthony, for joining us this afternoon.
My pleasure, Brian. Good to see you.
It's good to see you. I think we've had this line up before, all three of us. It seems to me, I'm pretty sure it's quite familiar. So,
indeed, a rematch.
Yes. Yep. Yes. So we'll start with our routine, sadly routine Ukraine update, and today is day 851. Russian-guided bombs shattered an apartment building in Ukraine's second largest city of Kharkiv on Saturday, killing 3 people and injuring 52, including 3 children, according to officials. Pictures posted online showed parts of the 5-storey apartment building in ruins, with windows smashed, balconies wrecked and rubble strewn about a crater on the ground. Regional Governor Ole Sinabov said 4 of those hurt were in serious condition. President Volodymyr Zelensky said this Russian terror, though guided bombs, must be stopped and can be stopped. Kharkiv lies about 30 kilometres or 20 miles from the border with Russia. President Zelensky called for more help to deal with the growing threat of Russian weapons. In his nightly video address, Zelensky said Russian forces had used more than 2,400 guided bombs on Ukrainian targets in June alone, with about 700 aimed at Kharkiv. He said after the US Congress gave a delayed approval of a big aid package in April, Ukraine's replenished arms supplies had reduced the devastation and frequency of missile attacks, and the same had to be done now to fend off these bombs. On Saturday, the Ukrainian governor of eastern Ukraine's partly occupied Donetsk region said that Russian attacks had killed 5 people and wounded 7 the previous day. Ukrainian attack drones again struck in Hobar, a town near the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power station, after drones earlier in the week hit 2 of the town's electric substations, a Russian-installed official said on Saturday. A new barrage of Russian missiles and drones damaged energy facilities in southeastern and western Ukraine on Saturday, wounding at least 2 energy workers and forcing record electricity imports, officials said. National grid operator Ukrenergo said equipment at its facilities in the southeastern Zaporizhzhia region and Lviv in the west had been damaged in the second large Russian air attack this week. Russian strikes also hit a gas infrastructure facility in the west of the country. The Ukrainian Navy said it was the first time that Russian forces had launched missiles from the Sea of Azov rather than the Black Sea. The Ukrainian air defense intercepted 12 of the 16 missiles and all 13 drones launched by Russia. Russian air defense systems destroyed 12 Ukrainian drones that targeted Russia's Bryansk region, according to the governor of the region. And Nigel Farage, leader of Reform UK, has doubled down on his claims that the West provoked the Russian invasion of Ukraine by refusing to apologise, despite his claims that he is not an apologist or supporter for Putin. In an article in The Telegraph, Farage said, "What I have been saying for the past 10 years is that the West has played into Putin's hands." On Saturday, French prosecutors charged 2 Moldovans suspected of painting coffins and a slogan urging an end to the Ukraine war on the facade of a prominent newspaper in the latest series of such acts in Paris in recent weeks. So, Anthony, I think I'll come to you first. Is there anything that you'd want to highlight from that Ukraine update?
Well, given that the general election is approaching, I suppose we can focus a little bit on what Nigel Farage has been saying or not saying. I think that that mainstream public opinion in Scotland and the rest of the UK is quite clear and matches with the reality, which is that Ukraine is not responsible for Russia's invasion. NATO is not responsible for it. Neither is the West collectively or the United States or anyone else. Russia is responsible for its own invasion. It was not inevitable. It was not a foregone conclusion. It was a cynical, terrible, deliberate decision by Putin and the Russian regime to invade Ukraine. I think we all know that. And for any sensible leader of a political party in the UK to suggest otherwise or to sort of muddy the waters is irresponsible, and I don't think it's going to persuade many voters in any part of the UK. And it's I know that we've seen these lines emerge in other European countries as well. But I think we all have a responsibility to point out that those arguments make no sense and certainly won't contribute to the ostensible aim, which is peace. Peace in Ukraine will happen when Russia ends its invasion. And the job for the UK, the EU, the United States is to do everything that it can to support Ukraine and to put pressure on Russia to end its invasion.
Thank you, Anthony. Paul, is there anything that you'd like to add?
Just to back up what Anthony said there, this is about Russian expansion. It's as simple as that. Ukraine, obviously, the Russians have invaded, but they've obviously got their eyes in other parts of what used to be the old Soviet Union. So this is all around about Russian expansionism, and it's no more than that. And Putin's obviously trying to push the boundaries elsewhere, not just in Europe, but in other parts of the world. And I think Anthony's right. The only way we're going to get peace is when the Russians finish their invasion. And Farage, I think, all this week has been trying to push the reform manifesto, if you like, and this is another ridiculous part of what's been coming out his mouth the last week or two. It's been absolutely ridiculous. But to say that the West are to blame for the invasion of Ukraine is totally ridiculous, and the man ridicules himself even without trying to do it. But yeah, and again, our thoughts need to go out to the people of Ukraine. In the news cycle, you get used to the bad news. We'll know we're talking about Gaza later on, but we shouldn't forget about the individual suffering that goes on every single day in the Ukraine.
Thank you, Paul. Speaking, you mentioned the Gaza, today's Gaza update. At least 37,551 Palestinians have been killed and 85,911 have been injured in Gaza since October, the 7th of October. 25 people died in shelling of the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, offices in Gaza, and the IDF strapped a wounded man to the front of a jeep in the West Bank. A wee bit more about that shocking item there. Israeli military said its forces violated protocol by strapping a wounded Palestinian man to the front of their vehicle during a raid on the West Bank in the city of Jenin. An IDF statement said that the man was wounded in an exchange of fire during the raid in which he was a suspect. The injured man's family said that when they asked for an ambulance, the army took him and strapped him to the bonnet of their jeep and drove off. He was eventually transferred to the Red Crescent for treatment. The Defence Minister Avigdor Lieberman said that the IDF, the Israel Defence Forces, is the most moral army in the world. Meanwhile, we've been watching unarmed Palestinians being shot dead by IDF snipers, including Yasser Murtaja, who was clearly wearing a flak jacket, identifying himself as a journalist when he was shot. And so the question is, I'll come to you first, Paul. Has the most moral army in the world lost its moral compass?
Without a doubt, Brian. I mean, this is just the latest incident that we've seen, been announced. I think we all seen the sniper killing the unarmed Palestinian man a number of months ago, and then we see this today, and then we see, and I heard this on the radio this morning. They seem to say, this is an isolated incident. We need to pick this up. The soldiers involved will be trained on terms that it's not a moral army. There's you used to hear the same thing coming from the other apartheid state, and make no mistake, Israel's an apartheid state, and from South Africa, and it used to say it was the most moral state, and we see this ridiculous position time after time after time after time about Palestinians literally being massacred and killed in front of people and treated like animals. And we see what's kind of going on in Gaza. This goes on in the West Bank. This goes on in every other single part of the occupied territories that the Israelis do, and it just becomes it just becomes white noise. You know, the West just seem to turn a blind eye to this, and it can't go on. It simply can't go on. And it's a ridiculous state again. It's not a moral army. And the UK, like other Western states, has a choice to how to treat Israel. You know, we were asked. Let's remember, the UK is one of the biggest arms providers to the Israeli state, and still continues to do that. And that's wrong. It's immoral. So there's choices that the UK has to make. There'll be choices that Keir Starmer has to make, and we know how, I suppose, mute he's been on that issue so far. But there's big discussions, big decisions that an income Labour government will have to make in this. But Israel being a moral state, the IDF, no, absolutely not.
Thank you, Paul. So, Anthony, what do you think of this claim that the IDF is the most moral army in the world? Is there an element of hypocrisy there?
Well, you certainly don't need a full inquiry to see that these incidents which have happened over the past few days don't just violate any sort of protocol, they violate universal human values. I think picking up what Paul was saying earlier, you know, there's a responsibility for the UK, the EU, and certainly the United States to evaluate their relationship with Israel as a whole. You know, right? I mean, all of them say that they want peace, and I'm sure that is true, and an end to this conflict. But you know, it's contradictory to for the United States in particular, for instance, to aim to try to stop the violence, to stop Israel's invasion of Gaza, but to be, you know, providing weapons, to be selling weapons, so on, right? I mean, it's very contradictory. So there needs to be, you know, a wholesale evaluation of what the relationship is with Israel, and whether or not it really aligns with what the overall goal should be. I think it's pretty clear that it's not in alignment. Until, you know, all of the international parties that could have any influence on Israel, or indeed have any influence on Hamas and on sort of, you know, the Palestinian Authority and so on, collectively come together and have a common line and have a common aim, and stick to that, then the sort of continued violence that we see will undoubtedly persist for some time.
Thank you, Anthony. So I'll move on to the next item. This week, interest rates in the UK fell to 2%. However, the Bank of England kept interest rates at 5.25%. That's the seventh consecutive freeze in interest rates since, despite the recent fall in interest rates to 2.2%. Forgive me, I'm tripping over my words here. So this also deprived Rishi Sunak of a much-needed boost ahead of the general election, as it would have cut the cost of borrowing if the interest rates had come down. Conversely, it's good for savers that the interest rate is staying at 5.25%. But the cost of living crisis means that people aren't really able to save at the moment. It's affecting, the cost of living crisis is affecting middle and lower incomes families the most. But what are the causes of this? So, Paul, I think it's your turn to go first.
Yeah,
what are the causes?
There's a number of things, and I think this comes all the way back to the choices in the election we face. I mean, to give a context, we've heard the IFS state that an income Labour government or income Tory government would need to cut public spending by about 19 billion pounds. We hear Keir Starmer coming out and saying, well, you know, we would close that gap by economic growth. Yet he still, he still looks and believes in where we are in regards to Brexit. And we've seen some figures coming out this week which shows lack of investment in the UK for that very reason. They're not going to invest into UK when growth has been impaired by Brexit, and will continue on a daily, a weekly, and a monthly basis to impact and growth opportunities for companies in the UK, and that includes Scotland, of course. So you know, why are countries going to invest, or companies going to invest in the UK, which is already a default position that it's got a lower growth rate than the rest of Europe, and that's the real challenge. And this is where it comes back to an independent Scotland making its own choice to go back into EU and trade with the EU. Keir Starmer nor Rishi Sunak is going to get real growth and productivity unless they rejoin the EU. And we see time after time, study after study, the impact that Brexit is having a drag on the UK economy. And that's the real reason why people aren't investing in the UK, and that won't change because that's not just 1 year, that's been the last 2 or 3 years. There's been a real drag on growth in the UK because of Brexit, and that's not going to change in terms of that. So again, that's a real choice that Keir Starmer more likely will have to make in terms of that. I hope that he decides after a period of time he needs to get the UK back into the EU. I very, very much doubt it, however.
Thank you, Paul. So, Anthony, Paul was talking about UK investment. So I've got a note here which says investment in the UK has trailed other G7 countries, including the US and Germany, since the mid-1990s, according to a report that urges Labour and the Conservatives to reverse planned cuts to investment or risk long-term damage to economic growth. What do you think about this?
So in terms of the UK's attractiveness towards international investors, I very much agree with Paul was saying, which is the single biggest driver. That would be the fact that the UK isn't in the EU. Having access to the single market, when you're making an investment in Europe, is extremely important to companies from the United States, from Japan, from India, from elsewhere. And that advantage that the UK had, coupled with the use of the English language, coupled with the attractiveness in some respects of the financial power and not just in London but also in Edinburgh and elsewhere, is gone. And if you want to be within the single market, then you'll go to Germany or to France or to Ireland or to the Netherlands, and these countries have all benefited at Scotland's and the rest of the UK's expense. So that is a core aspect of the UK's sort of relative lack of attractiveness when it comes to inward investment. I think there are other dimensions as well. One is the UK government's inability to articulate a coherent industrial strategy. This is the Conservative government over the past few prime ministers have oscillated on this, from not believing in having an industrial strategy to sort of trying to cobble one together that's not very coherent. And that, I think that's quite important in the era in which we're moving into, which is that the UK was traditionally one of the largest economies in the world. The size of the UK economy relative to other countries will continue to shrink, and also being outside of the EU in that context, you need to have a really coherent sort of economic policy, fiscal policy, a good industrial strategy. Previous UK governments haven't had that, and it's unclear whether or not Labour will either, presuming that they win the next election, as all the polls indicate, because Keir Starmer has oriented so much of his campaign of being as minimalist as possible in making change. And I think it's quite interesting that the main argument from Labour as well, we're not going to raise taxes, we're not going to borrow. It's all going to come from economic growth. How especially given the UK's distant and minimal relationship with the European Union, which remains an extremely important trade partner on our doorstep. I'm skeptical that without making any kind of substantial change to fiscal policy or economic policy, growth will suddenly materialize after sort of years of minimal growth.
Thank you, Anthony. Paul, have I recently been hearing the First Minister standing up in debates in the run-up to the general election and giving figures, and in Holyrood, I think, as well, at FMQs, figures that claim that Scotland is outperforming the UK when it comes to investment and economy?
Yeah, there's been, and I mean, I think Scotland performs well in terms of inward investment. It consistently performs well and has done for a number of years, probably over a decade now, and probably is just behind London in terms of inward investment, because people see the opportunities in various sectors that we have, whether that's life sciences, whether that's gaming, whether there's and other technologies, obviously renewables and so on. And we're seeing that, for example, in the Green Freeport and other parts of Scotland in terms of that. Scotland does do that. But again, we don't have the full powers to, such as tax credits and so on, to try and bring other countries investing into Scotland. So we do relatively well. Our economy is performing, again, relatively well in terms of where we kind of sit. But as always, we're performing with one hand tied behind our back. And coming back to the core point that both Anthony and I raised, we want to go back into the EU and the opportunities that would give Scotland. And I know it's, I was just across in Germany for the football, and it's interesting, you're across there and everybody welcomes Scotland fans. But then the discussion starts to go into politics, and almost ultimately goes in politics. And people want to see Scotland back in the EU. In any part of Europe, I'm not just talking about football, anywhere you meet people from Europe, in any discussions you have, people want Scotland back in the EU because they see the benefits that Scotland would bring and the benefits that Scotland would also receive in terms of that. So, yes, we perform well. We're tied. We've got one hand tied behind our back. But for Scotland to rejoin the EU, I think would be welcomed with open arms and give us a real opportunity to turbocharge our economy and kick on and be a successful European nation, just like our neighbours who are the same size right across Europe.
Thank you, Paul. Anthony, I'm wondering if I can bring in productivity. Every time I hear the word productivity mentioned, I kind of think my first reaction is to think that, that means that people are going to have to work longer hours, work harder for the hours that they are at work and things like that. But it's not really, is it? Productivity means making it easier, investing in infrastructure so that workers can get to work quicker because the roads are better or the public transport's good, or invest in education, meaning that you've got a well-educated workforce and things like that. Do you see those kinds of efforts being put into productivity after the general election?
So, it's difficult to tell because, as I was alluding to before, Labour have been very vague about what they actually intend to do, provided they win. Clearly that has been an intentional electoral strategy on their part. They've been well ahead in the polls, and they don't want to do or say anything that might sort of dissuade people from voting for them. Coupled with the fact that they believe that their path to power is being much closer to the centre rather than to the centre left. So there's a bit of an unknown here. But you're right to say that in terms of the health of the economy and prospects for economic growth, there are a huge range of factors in terms of investment, sure, as in terms of foreign investment in Scotland or elsewhere in the UK, but in terms of education, skills, training, ensuring that there are good quality jobs and that people are trained to be able to take them up. Those are all important. This touches on responsibilities in Scotland that are for the Scottish government, and some aspects for the UK government. And everything is relative here, I suppose. When it comes to productivity, people in other parts of Europe, either might have the same level of productivity UK or the higher, but they often work less, as in fewer hours, are more productive in the fewer hours that they have. I suppose if we're not already, we're trying to sort of study that and speak to people in those countries and figure out how they're more productive, but they can still have in some cases a better work-life balance. So if you look at countries like Germany or Sweden, for instance, where there's a much more structured, regular, productive dialogue between business leaders and trade unions, and it's really embedded into the culture and that's quite an interesting model to look at, for instance. But just ensuring that we were as prepared as possible for the industries of the future, keeping in mind that everything in this sort of prospects for the economy is relative. So Scotland may be doing well as relative to London or other parts of the UK, but we're always talking about could we even be better than that, right? And that's a difficult argument to make sometimes. I think a recent estimate from the Office for Budget Responsibility is what the UK economy was 4%, or GDP rather, was 4% smaller than it would have been if the UK had stayed in the EU. So, sometimes it could be a bit challenging to say, well, we would have been better off if this hadn't happened. But it's still true. It's still a loss. So, is Scotland doing well? Perhaps, but we could be doing even better if the UK had never left the EU to begin with. And there's not much we can do about that. But of course, there is thinking about what we can do for the future. And hopefully that means being closer to the EU, or indeed in the EU.
Thank you, Anthony. So, Paul, just before we leave it, I've got a note here which says that among OECD countries, only Greece, Luxembourg and Poland were ranked lower for business investment than the UK over the last 3 years. I'm struggling to think of a question to put. What do you think? Is there anything else that you want to say about this item before we move on?
I think there's a number of reasons, and I think Anthony and I both touched on it. One, I think, is in terms of the uncertainty around about Brexit and the ongoing impact that's had. I think there's broader political, I suppose the political issues that the UK has suffered in the last number of years as well. You've seen the Liz Truss budget, which was an absolute disaster, which again I think has impacted on interest rates. It's impacted on the ability for our economy to grow, and we're still having that impact going through just now. We've seen inflation, although it's now come down to 2% target. It's been high for a relatively high period of time. So I think it's a combination of things that have kind of come through. And as I said, it looks like it's going to be Keir Starmer government, but we do need more innovative policies in terms of how do we increase productivity. That's the main challenge to any government kind of coming in, is how do we increase productivity, and that's been a decades-long challenge for the UK. But adding on, as I said, the issues about Brexit, adding on political uncertainty in UK, I'm not surprised. This has been the situation. And again, it comes back to the crux matter. The IFS have talked about 18 to 19 billion pounds of cuts to the UK public spending. Now that's going to impact on Scotland as well. So even our share could be talking between 1.5 billion and 2 billion pounds. The only way Keir Starmer says that they're going to mitigate that is through growth. But we're not going to see growth in the current way that Keir Starmer would set up a UK economy. So I think we'll come to that point very, very quickly when the OBR has a look at the Labour budget, looks at its fiscal policies, which says it's not going to change, and then realises we're going to be heading down to more cuts, which again will impact on future investment opportunities. And we're talking about investing in public spending. This is a political choice that Keir Starmer will face. Does he try and raise taxes to make sure there's an opportunity? And that's what we should do if we are raising taxes. It should be then to invest in public services. When we've got probably a period now of dropping interest rates, which will be dropping. The Bank of England have talked about that. So it's a real challenge, but it's one I fear that Keir Starmer won't have the political courage to do.
Thank you, Paul. So the next item is the UK general election 2024, but on a UK level. And then we'll move on to talk about it at a Scottish level. So most folks seem to agree that Rishi Sunak moved his party to the right to assuage the far-right colleagues within the Conservative Party with policies like the Rwanda scheme, and also maybe he tacked right in an attempt to undermine Nigel Farage and his Reform Party. Then this week, Andy Haldane, a former chief economist of the Bank of England, has warned that there's only a lettuce leaf between Labour's plans and the Tories in terms of stimulating growth in the UK economy. Now, in my mind, that sounds like Starmer's government is going to look like a David Cameron government, or maybe how it looked when Tony Blair was in government, somewhat to the right of Corbyn or indeed to the SNP. So if the centre moves to the right, or centre parties move to the right, do far-right parties stay where they are until they merge? Or when the centre moves to the right, does it encourage the far-right parties to move even further to the extreme right, to the far right? In other words, are we starting to look at the foothills of fascism? So, Anthony, I wonder if you'd like to tackle that one first.
Certainly. Well, in terms of the sort of placement of the Conservative Party, this has been going on for at least 10 years, if not more than that, back to David Cameron's decision to seek to at first renegotiate the UK's EU membership and then to hold the sort of EU referendum. The whole point of that was fear in the run-up to the then 2015 UK general election that then UKIP was going to sort of, best the Tories and either take away the majority or win a number of seats and so on. So the Conservative Party has been concerned about the right and the far right for years, and have tried, to do everything they can to mitigate that threat by moving further to the right, by bringing up the potential of Brexit, and then after the EU referendum, eventually belatedly, after many challenges and difficulties realizing Brexit, and indeed on immigration and on other issues, and that has been a consistent trajectory. I think Rishi Sunak is the latest prime minister to continue to move the Conservative Party in that direction, and by extension, as I was speaking about earlier, Labour are trying to win the election by being as centre as possible. And if the Conservatives have shifted the centre further to the right, then that in a sense means that the Labour by extension is also further to the right than it was before, and certainly much further right than Jeremy Corbyn, of course. So yes, that's sort of where those two main parties are. In terms of what happens after the election, Of course, it's difficult to say. We'll need to see the results first, but it does feel that things are a little bit different, which is to say that the sort of the two-party system at UK level between Labour, at least in England, between Labour and the Conservatives, has been very stable for a number of decades. I think to the start of the century, but it does feel like this could really be a moment where things actually change, where it's possible that Reform UK could do well, or maybe not surpass the Conservatives, but certainly compete to be sort of a major opposition party, at least in England, perhaps in England and Wales. And the Conservatives could be sort of either at par with them or relegated, and Labour could have a huge majority. And that may mean that in the years following this next month's election and headed towards the next general election after that, the Reform on its own or merge with the Conservative Party could be a new opposition party or a new major political party in the UK that is quite to the right or indeed far right, and we'd see a realignment of party politics at UK level, and that hasn't happened to date, right? So UKIP gained quite a number of votes in the 2015 general election and translates to very few or no seats. Things may be different this time.
Thank you, Anthony. And Paul, the same question to you, I suppose. Are we looking at the foothills of fascism with this general election?
I wouldn't quite go that far. I think some of the things that Nigel Farage has been saying, and we talked about it earlier on, such as his views on Russia and Ukraine, have been quite frightening, to be honest with you. And some of the other policy discussions that he's been having, it's quite clear that Reform don't have a manifesto that would stand up to any form of scrutiny. It's just absolutely ridiculous. But I'd come back to some of the points that Anthony was saying. Labour aren't winning this election as they did in 1997, where there was a real push for Tony Blair in terms of that. People aren't clamouring for a Keir Starmer government. There's no clear... I know they keep on saying it's about change, but when you actually think around about where Starmer is winning this by default, because the right of UK politics is split. If you look at some of the polls at the moment, you're roughly seeing Reform and the Conservatives not far off 40%, and Labour not far off that as well, at a time when you've probably had the most inept Tory government that's there. So this isn't a big, I think, endorsement for Keir Starmer, and that's going to be part of his challenge. I think we could be looking at a situation similar to Canada after the right-wing Conservative government there lost very, very heavily. So where do we see the right wing of UK politics go? And I think that's going to be probably one of the more interesting things after this election is what happens to the Conservative government. Rishi Sunak obviously is going to have to resign. Who then comes in and takes over that leadership? Do they then reach out to Nigel Farage? And I think in terms of the public vote, I think Reform will do well. In terms of seats, I don't think they'll do as well as that. But I think the broader realignment after this, I think it will be very interesting for what happens in UK politics, and then how that feeds through to Scottish politics. What do the Scottish Conservatives do, for example? So there's interesting things in terms of that. It's also going to be in terms of how, I suppose, is Keir Starmer going to play the safe game all the way through this, because he knows he's not going to have much of an opposition. The UK can't afford to do that in terms of where the economy is, can't afford to do that in terms of where its public finances are either. So, it's not a clear endorsement for Keir Starmer. This is a right of UK politics splitting after that. So Keir Starmer's still got a lot to do to sell his vision, and I think polls have showed this, to sell his vision of where he wants to see the UK go. And, you've now got a Labour government that's going to commit to not raising taxes in the UK and in Scotland when there's a time that the public sector and needs it more than ever. So the Labour Party have moved both in the UK and Scotland. It's not a centre-left party now. It's a centre party. It's as simple as that. It's not centre-left. It doesn't believe in progressive taxation. It doesn't believe in different tax and fiscal powers in the UK. It's following fiscal powers, fiscal framework that the UK has followed. It's going to follow the same fiscal rules that are there within the UK as well, and borrowing. So it's a centre party. But the really interesting thing, we'll see, where does the right of UK politics go after this? I think there is a big realignment coming, and whoever takes on the mantle of the Conservative Party leader after Rishi Sunak resigns has a really big job in their hands to keep the Conservative Party together. There will be some form of realignment between Reform and Conservatives, I have no doubt about that.
Thanks, Paul. You just said that Labour's not for progressive taxes, and yet I did hear Keir Starmer distinctly describe the Labour Party as being progressive just the other day, which. And so my question to both of you now is, I wonder if either or both of you can help me, because I genuinely am struggling to understand, why is Starmer keeping to so many of the Tories' fiscal pledges? Surely with the Tories' massive unpopularity, Starmer should be tacking in the opposite direction. Anthony, can you explain to me why Labour's sticking to Tory policies?
Well, it might help to remember that Keir Starmer was part of Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. He was the shadow Brexit secretary, and then saw how Jeremy Corbyn's campaign in the sort of 2017-2019 general election in particular, obviously didn't work very well and delivered a very poor result for Labour. And I imagine that made quite an impression on Starmer, and he wants to win, and he wants to gain power. And he and his advisors and the team around him and his remolded shadow cabinet in the main have decided that the only way to win the election is to be as close to the center as possible. And these all link to long-standing sort of self-esteem concerns that the Labour Party has had in England. That the only way to win is to be in the center, to convince sort of people who might vote for Labour, who sometimes vote for the Conservatives or sort of will vote for the Lib Dems, whatever, that it's safe to vote for Labour, that Labour will be safe on the economy and not spend radical sums and so on. These arguments, and so instead of trying to dispel those arguments, Labour has been trying to persuade people that it is a party that can be trusted on these issues, rather than offer a bold vision or indeed a progressive vision that people might want to positively vote for, which is linking a bit to what Paul was saying earlier, that people voting for Labour might be doing so just because they're dissatisfied with the Conservatives rather than they're eager for Labour to take power. And one reason for that could be is that Labour is not articulating an inspiring vision that would motivate people to vote for them on that basis, that positive basis anyway. But so that is the strategy, to be as conservative, as it were, with a small c as possible, and to let the Conservatives continue to be in meltdown, and just hope that people will vote for Labour as the only real alternative, and win on that basis. But it makes it very difficult to know what Labour would actually do if they win. Will they truly stick to this sort of bland centrist sort of borrowing of Tory policy position, or will they be ambitious, particularly if you win a large majority, as the polls are suggesting might be the case? Then that would give you license to implement your manifesto and implement your policies. Labour might have a bit of difficulty in that score because their manifesto is very thin. But if Labour did win over 100-seat majority, for instance, which might be possible, I really couldn't say what they would do with that majority. But you'd think that if you were a party that had been in opposition for 15 or so years, that you'd want to be implementing some major policy changes. But we would just have to wait and see what they did, which is an odd position to be in.
Thank you, Anthony. Paul, so the Bank of England economist I referenced earlier, he spoke about the lettuce leaf between Labour and Tory plans. I'm going to maybe change the question, or not the question, but how do you explain for the wee boy hair between the Labour and Tory plans? Why isn't he going in the opposite direction?
I genuinely think that he's probably the most right wing, or the most right wing Labour Party leader that they've had for a considerable period of time. We've heard Wes Streeton say, for example, that he wanted to take NHS reforms much further than Blair did, for example, and I think that he's genuinely a centre leader, not a centre-left leader, because if we see the policies that are there, and it kind of comes back to the points we were talking about before. We've had 14 years of Tory austerity that's been there. Public services have been cut to the bone. The Scottish Government budget has been cut to the bone, needing investment in public services, which will drive economic growth. Now, there are a number of ways to do that. One, we need investment in public spending. That would need increased borrowing from a UK government. And I think the only way to look at that in the current, because we've got to remember the UK public debt is at a record high level, but I think it would be justified if it is for investment into public services, which in itself would drive growth. Or you have to look at the raising taxes, or a combination of both. So you've got a Labour government who won't increase borrowing for public sector investment. You've got a Labour Party that won't increase tax rates. And Keir Starmer says he just wants to get that through growth. And then you're getting independent analysis, saying you won't get that growth unless you go back into the EU. I fail to see what the Labour Party is going to be doing to try and drive economic growth. And Anthony's right, it's trying to present itself as being more competent than the Tories, but follows its economic rules, follows its fiscal rules, won't raise taxes, won't borrow for public sector investment. And I think it's very short-term politics. Yeah, it's to get elected, but then I know we'll be going on to talk about the Scottish election, and there'll be the Welsh election at the same time. People will be expecting a change very quickly. And without a major change in the policies we've just talked about, we won't achieve growth. We won't achieve, the things we've talked about, the increase in productivity and so on. And austerity will continue, and hence why we've seen IFS come out and said without material change, there would be public spending cuts of 18 to 19 million pounds for either Labour or the Tories. And again, the only kickback you get from Keir Starmer or Anna Sarwar is, we'll achieve that through economic growth. That's not going to happen without major policy change, and Labour need to go further to the centre left rather than the centrist party that they are just now, because they want to get into power, and it's a short-term policy outlook that I think will come back and bite them in the backside in a couple of years' time in the Scottish Parliament elections, because all they're going to be doing is following current Tory party rules on borrowing, on tax, and that's not going to work. We need investment into public services. It's as simple as that.
Thanks, Paul. We're over time on this item, and I do want to move on to the general election in Scotland, but I've just got one question that I'd like to ask you quickly. So if Labour does win the general election and they do stick to Tory economic policy, what will happen in 5 years' time? Will the media turn on an unpopular Labour government because they weren't able to bring that change that they're claiming that they will? Anthony, just very quickly, have you got any predictions?
Well, if that is the case, I don't think that the Labour will just need to worry about the media. I think they'll need to worry about public opinion. But it's hard to know, because we don't know what the rest of the political spectrum will look like, right? We don't know what will happen to Conservatives and their relationship with Reform UK. So it is possible that even if Labour, sort of mimic sort of Conservative policies, economic fiscal policies, that the right will be so weak that Labour could win the next general election anyway. But I don't think the public would be very happy.
Thank you, Anthony. And Paul, just really quickly, so we can get on to Scotland, what do you think would happen?
I agree with what Anthony says in that, and I think there's one lesson to learn from politics. We've had 1 week, it's a long time in politics, 5 years. When Boris Johnson won the last election with an 80-plus majority, we were told this might have another 10, 15 years of Tory government. So to look 5 years ahead, I think is going to be extremely difficult, and probably which is the most volatile time in UK politics, looking at realignment of the right, the centre-left moving to the centre, and not changing much. So 5 years' time, who knows? Hopefully Scotland will be independent by that time. We won't need to worry about Westminster. But yeah, it's 5 years' time. It's going to be very difficult to judge. But Anthony's right. If the Labour Party don't change things relatively quickly, there'll be dissatisfaction again. And this is where you get a real problem, because if we are talking around about no change from either the Labour or the Tories, this is where the extremes come in. And we've seen that in different parts of Europe. And this is where it could be coming in. It's not just realignment to the right, it could be movement to the far right, which would be extremely worrying.
Thank you, Paul. So this week, John Swinney launched the SNP manifesto. He did that on Wednesday, and as promised, it had independence on page 1, line 1. Indeed, more than that, line 1 filled the entire first page. So this morning, Martin Geisler gave Douglas Ross a hard time on the BBC. Geisler pressed Ross on the point that the union is supposed to be voluntary and asked, if that's true, what's the route for Scotland to become independent? This is in a country where half of the population currently support independence, more or less, roundabout. Geisler did the same recently with Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer wasn't really able to come up with a good answer to that question. So if voters in Scotland send a majority of independents supporting MSPs to Holyrood, and if a UK government once again refuses to respect that, what does it say about democracy in the UK? So, Paul, I'll come to you first if you'd like to say something on that.
Yeah, and Brian, I think you're right. And if you look at any unionist supporting politician asking is this a voluntary union or not, all you have the usual lines. We've already voted on it. Alex Salmond said it's once in a generation. Democracy changes. It's as simple as that. People change their minds. It's as simple as that. And you have to just look across to the border poll suggestions or discussions. It was agreed. If there was a border poll, it was agreed to have another one within 7 years. So they can't say it's fine for a possible border poll on Irish unification and then say something completely different for an independence referendum. It's not a voluntary union. It's as simple as that. And I have never heard an answer from a UK politician. I was just at Hustings last week where I covered for our candidate who'd had a sore back, and Douglas Alexander was there, who's a Labour candidate in Lothian East, and asked, is it a voluntary union? And asked anybody to come back in, and he just sat there in silence, never said a word. So it's not a voluntary union. Whatever way the unionists want to push it, it's not a voluntary union. And they can't answer the question. When they're pushed, they can't answer the question. It's not a voluntary union. It's as simple as that. And so it is denying democracy. Despite where the SNP are in the polls, despite what would happen in 2026, we could have a situation, another pro-independence majority government, and we've seen Stammer come out and said he wouldn't give a referendum. So I just find the whole thing, it's depressing. When you can't give Scotland the right to decide on its own destiny.
Thank you, Paul. Anthony, it's the same question, but just slightly rephrased. I mean, isn't this the strongest argument for independence? Because an independent country gets the government it votes for every time, at least in theory. But if we look at Brexit, because I know that you're you're an expert on that, because Scotland's vote was lumped in with the rest of the UK and without a right of veto, we're now out of the EU. So isn't this voluntary union question the strongest argument for independence?
Well, it certainly demonstrates that there's a lack of clarity on what the UK really is, right? I mean, we could have a whole show or multiple shows just on this question, right? But I suppose one way to look at it, and as I have in some of my research, is why did the 2014 independence referendum happen? I think there are different stories about that. One story is that the SNP won a majority in the preceding Holyrood election on the manifesto pledge that there should be a referendum, and the government, facilitate that because that was a clear democratic expression of the people of Scotland in that Holyrood election. Another framing of that, and I think the second one is what most sort of unionist politicians will take, is that, or at least certainly sort of ones in the London bubble, is that the UK government decided to, out of the generosity of its heart, to allow a referendum to happen. In part because also they thought that they would win. And then it's up to the UK government, to the UK Parliament, to decide whether or when a referendum should happen. And on that second line, then you get these sort of weaker arguments of, there was a referendum a few years back, and we already had one, or it was the apocryphal pledge about being once in a generation, and so on, because there is no good argument on that score, because it would demonstrate that the UK is first of all not a voluntary union, and second of all that true decision-making power lies in London, regardless of what people in Scotland decide or vote for, be it at a Holyrood election or sort of a Westminster election, and that's not a good place to be. I think that people can accept that whether or not you want independence to happen or not, that people in Scotland should decide. And that's not just about deciding in a referendum, that's about sort of deciding whether or not a referendum should happen.
Thank you, Anthony. And so here in the studio before we started, me and my colleagues were having a wee discussion, a wee minor debate about whether Scotland is oppressed or not. And I was kind of thinking, you have to be careful because a lot of countries which are truly oppressed would say that we're not. But Paul, But maybe there is something to it, but very subtle. So the First Minister, John Swinney, was on the BBC Question Time Leaders Debate the other night, and some commented that why is someone that English voters can't vote for included, and shouldn't he have been replaced by Nigel Farage, who is standing UK wide? Yet John Swinney is the official leader of the third biggest party in Westminster. He's Stephen Flynn's boss. So is that kind of argument a nuanced example how very subtly maybe Scotland is oppressed in some way?
I think we have to be very careful about language, and it kind of takes me back to 2014, and I think the recognition of giving Scotland its place, because I remember in some of the discussions before 2014 is stay in the UK, Scotland, and lead the UK, and that's obviously not been the case. I think in terms of that, you're at the centre of the UK, and obviously not at the terms of that. So that's never. That's not changed. A lot of it would be around about respect. What's Scotland's place within the UK, and what it does in terms of economic growth and other areas that are there. So I think there's a complete lack of respect for what Scotland's place is in the UK, but also as a devolved nation. And I think the Welsh Government feels the same as well. Now, I think that's a challenge for Keir Starmer as well. How does he see his relationship with the devolved nations? Obviously, it's going to be Labour government in Wales and Labour government in the UK, but it's around about respect, and I think there's a clear definition. It's not about respect just for the Parliament. It's not just about respect for the SNP if it's in power. It's respect for the Scottish people. The reason why there's a pro-independence majority in Scotland is because that's what Scottish people voted for. So it's respecting the Scottish people first and foremost. You can almost understand to a certain point around about not respecting political parties, and I think that's wrong. But not respecting the Scottish people is the biggest mistake that I think they could make. So we'll soon see in terms of Keir Starmer, in terms of that being picked up, but what his relationship will be with a devolved Scottish government. Because at the moment, even speaking as a minister, just trying to even get a discussion with the UK government is almost impossible. Almost impossible. And in my time, I've been a housing minister for about a year and 3 months. There have been 4 housing ministers. Over the last 4.5 years, there have been 16 housing ministers. And I know department across department, the UK government don't take Scottish government seriously. They don't come back to us. They don't have meetings. They don't answer correspondence. There is no respect agenda at all. So we'll soon see very quickly what's the respect between the Scottish people, which is more important, but also between the Scottish Parliament and the UK Parliament is what respect do they have for the institution. Again, I have my doubts whether they'll respect that or not. And the more they do that, the more that will push people towards independence, because I think you'll have the situation that people will say in Scotland, we want to get rid of the Tories, let's see what the change is. Once they get the change and the change isn't anything at all, then people will move on and say, look, we've had the Tories, we've had Labour, we need to move on and get independence. That's the only way to get change. And I think people will see that.
Thank you, Paul. And just by the way, Paul, I'm really happy to agree with you about language is important, and I did feel uneasy using the "all" word there, and I think respect is an excellent response to that. But Anthony, that instance about the First Minister and people saying, "Oh, only people living in Scotland can vote for him. Why is he in a leadership debate?" Doesn't that illustrate that there is something that where Scotland is being treated or being seen or viewed differently to the rest of the UK?
I think it demonstrates, and we all know this, that in the London bubble, London is important, and England is important, and other parts of the UK are either not particularly well understood, or indeed, not fully respected. That goes for Scotland, but it also goes for Wales in some instances, and certainly for Northern Ireland. I think if you look at the sort of the Brexit saga, a huge part of the sort of campaign to leave the EU was based on ignoring what the implications of Brexit would be for Northern Ireland, and then over the years of the negotiations and difficulties of trying to leave the EU, of a UK government which didn't showcase that it cared a lot about what happened to people in Northern Ireland, and it was more content on sort of concluding a deal with the EU that was as distant as possible. So why would it be that someone during the debate would question why sort of a leader of a Scottish party could be there, even though the SNP have the third biggest cohort of MPs, or did before the dissolution of the House of Commons, reflects the way that some people think, and we could only hope that that changes.
Thank you, Anthony. The last item is something that I know absolutely nothing about, truly. Some viewers might say that includes most of the topics that we talk about here on the Full Scottish and Broadcasting Scotland. But the Euros. Tonight, it's a make or break for Scotland's men's national team. So will Scotland go forward to the playoffs for the first time? Let's see. Paul, I believe you were at... you were in Germany for the match, so what do you think? What was it like?
Yeah, Brian, I'm a big football fan. I've been a member of the Tartan Army for over 30 years, so I've followed Scotland through thick and thin, at home and overseas, for a number of years. Was in Germany last week for the first game, which wasn't the best of games. Family were still over there for the game during the week. I do think Scotland will go through. I think we've got a really good group of players this time that will go through. The support over in Germany has been absolutely incredible, and I think we've heard the Mayor of Cologne and the Mayor of Munich talking about the fantastic behaviour from Scottish fans. About 4 or 5% of the Scottish population was over there. It was absolutely incredible. And the feel good feeling, I think, when you're seeing people respect how well behaved the fan base it was, and the fans are a real credit to Scotland. Always have been, always will be. And I have to say, the first game against Germany, hearing the Flower of Scotland being sung by about 8,000 to 9,000 Scottish fans was hairs in the back of your neck. It was absolutely incredible. So I do think we'll go through. It'll create history in Scotland. So I'll be waiting here tonight, 8 o'clock, desperate for Scotland to get the result to get us through. And if we do, we'd hope to go back, because I think the games are next weekend, so it wouldn't clash with Parliament, which obviously goes into recess after this week. So fingers crossed I'll be heading back to Germany at the next week.
Thank you, Paul. And Anthony, I think you're more like me. You're not really that into it. So I'll ask you: do you think the positive way that the Tartan Army has been seen in Germany recently, could that make it a vote for pro-independence parties in the upcoming general election more likely? Do you think?
I'm not sure what the implications would be for the election here, but it's certainly been really heartwarming to see sort of the community spirit, if you like, not just of the people who made it across to Germany, but also people here behind the Scotland team. I think I will be watching, but with my eyes closed probably. And I don't know what impact it will have on the election, but it's nice for us to remember that despite our political differences, we can come together as a country when it matters.
Thank you, Anthony. And so we're just about out of time. So just because I'm not a football fan, it doesn't mean that I don't want them to win. So I wish the Tartan Army all the very best for tonight's game. I'm sure everybody here in the studio does, and everybody at home too. So that's about it. So before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. We are focused now on securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding, and we depend on the support to be able to pay our bills every month. But before we go, thank you once again. Thank you to Anthony, and thank you also to you, Paul, both of you, for giving up a sizable chunk of what's left of the weekend. Really appreciate it.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
You're welcome. So with that, I'll just say goodbye and let everybody get back to what is left of the weekend. All the best and goodbye.